A single typo can alter the trajectory of a life. Clara just wanted to dump a man who couldn't remember her birthday. Her thumb slipped on a cracked phone screen, sending her final, bitter goodbye into the digital void. The reply she received 30 seconds later didn't come from a pathetic ex begging for another chance. It came from a man who ran the city's underworld. A man who offered a dangerous proposition. Wrong number. But come over. I'll make you forget him. Rain lashed against the single-pane window of Clara's apartment, rattling the glass in its cheap aluminum frame. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays were entirely devoid of magic. Clara sat at her tiny kitchen table, tracing the rim of a coffee mug that held lukewarm Pinot Grigio. She wore an oversized grey sweater that smelled faintly of dry cleaning fluid and exhaustion. Across from her sat a plate of cold pasta. 2 forks, one untouched. Todd was late. Again. She checked her phone. The screen was spider-webbed with cracks from when she'd dropped it, rushing to catch the subway 3 days ago. 9:42 p.m. He had promised to be here at 7. It was their anniversary. 2 years of lowering her expectations, accommodating his moods, and accepting apologies that meant nothing. Her phone buzzed, a notification from Instagram. Clara didn't want to look, but her thumb moved of its own accord. It was a story posted by a mutual friend. A crowded dive bar downtown, loud music, flashing neon lights. And there, in the background, was Todd. He had his arm slung around a blonde woman Clara didn't recognize, his head thrown back in a laugh, holding a shot glass. Something inside Clara broke. It wasn't a loud snap. It was a quiet, pathetic unraveling, like a cheap thread giving way in the seam of a well-worn coat. She wasn't even angry. She was just deeply, profoundly tired. She set the wine down. She opened her messages and tapped on a number she hadn't saved as a contact out of pure stubbornness. She began to type. I saw the story. Don't bother coming here. Don't bother calling tomorrow. I am so entirely done with being your afterthought. Leave your keys in the mailbox. We're over. Her vision blurred with a sudden, humiliating sting of tears. She'd scrubbed at her eyes with the heel of her hand. Her thumb hovered over the send button. The crack on her screen distorted the digits at the top, but she didn't care. She jammed her finger down. Message delivered. Clara tossed the phone onto the cheap laminate table. She expected the familiar nausea, the panic of a breakup. Instead, she felt nothing but a hollow draft in her chest. She stood up, grabbed the cold plate of pasta, and dumped it into the trash. Across the city, in a neighborhood where the air felt cleaner and the silence was expensive, a phone vibrated on a mahogany desk. Arthur stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights bleed through the rain. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in a year, but he wore it like armor. His tie was loosened. A glass of amber liquid sat untouched on the windowsill. The room was vast, lined with leather-bound books that had never been read and abstract art that Arthur found utterly pointless. It was the office of a man who owned things, who owned people. Behind him, a man in a black trench coat was bleeding onto a plastic drop cloth spread over the Persian rug. "I didn't take the shipment, Mr. Rossi," the man gasped, clutching a fractured rib. "I swear to God." Arthur didn't turn around. He took a slow sip of his drink. "God doesn't audit my shipping containers, Leo. I do." He walked over to his desk, stepping carefully over the edge of the plastic. His phone buzzed again, illuminating the dark wood. Arthur frowned. Only 4 people had this number. 3 of them were currently in the room. The 4th was dead. He picked it up. An unknown number. "I saw the story. Don't bother coming here. Don't bother calling tomorrow. I am so entirely done with being your afterthought. Leave your keys in the mailbox. We're over. Arthur stared at the screen. The sheer, raw frustration in the text was palpable. It felt completely alien in this room. A room currently suffocating under the weight of lies and impending violence. It was a distress signal from a mundane, ordinary world he had never been a part of. He looked down at Leo, who was whimpering quietly. The boredom that constantly gnawed at the edges of Arthur's mind suddenly flared. He was tired of this, tired of the groveling, the predictable betrayals, the endless cycle of blood and money. He looked back at the screen. He should delete it. He should block the number. Instead, a strange, cynical amusement twisted the corner of his mouth. He typed with one hand while holding his scotch in the other. Wrong number. But come over. I'll make you forget him. 4200 North Shore Drive. Gates will be open. He hit send. Then he tossed the phone back onto the desk and finally looked at the bleeding man on the floor. Clean this up, Arthur said to the two silent guards standing in the shadows. Get him out of my house. Part 2. The Departure. Clara was scraping congealed tomato sauce off a pan when her phone chimed. She froze. The sponge dripped grey water into the sink. It had been less than a minute. Todd never replied this fast. He usually let her stew for hours, waiting until she was desperate enough to apologize for being upset. She dried her hands on a ragged dish towel and walked back to the table. She picked up the phone. Wrong number. But come over. I'll make you forget him. 4200 North Shore Drive. Gates will be open. Clara read the message 3 times. The words didn't make sense. Wrong number. She checked the recipient. A 7 instead of a 1. Her cracked screen had betrayed her. A flush of deep embarrassment crept up her neck. She had sent her pathetic, vulnerable breakup speech to a complete stranger. She started to type an apology, her thumbs moving quickly. I am so sorry. Typo. Please ignore. She deleted it. She stared at the address. 4200 North Shore Drive. Everyone in the city knew North Shore Drive. It was the jagged cliffside road overlooking the bay, lined with estates that looked like fortresses. It was where the billionaires, the politicians, and the ghosts lived. People who didn't go to dive bars, people who didn't eat cold pasta. Come over. I'll make you forget him. It was a line from a bad movie. It was dangerous. It was a guaranteed way to end up on the evening news. Clara knew all of this. She was 26 years old, a data entry clerk with a degree she couldn't use, trapped in a life that felt like a waiting room. She was practical. She paid her taxes. She looked both ways before crossing the street. She looked around her apartment. The peeling wallpaper in the corner. The pile of mail on the counter, mostly bills. The empty wine glass. If she stayed here, she would cry. She would wait for Todd to come back. And when he finally did, smelling of stale beer and cheap perfume, she would probably forgive him. Because she was terrified of being alone. Because she had forgotten how to be anything else. Clara walked to the closet. She didn't think. She just moved. She pulled on a pair of faded black jeans and a leather jacket she'd bought at a thrift store 5 years ago. She grabbed her keys and shoved her feet into a pair of worn-out boots. The rational part of her brain was screaming. What are you doing? He could be a murderer. Good, the cynical part of her replied. At least he's not Todd. The rain was coming down in sheets when she stepped outside. She ran to her 10-year-old Honda Civic, the engine groaning in protest as she turned the key. The heater didn't work. She shivered, gripping the steering wheel as she pulled out onto the slick asphalt. The drive took 40 minutes. The city dissolved in the rearview mirror, replaced by winding roads and heavy dripping trees. The streetlights grew sparse. The houses grew larger, set far back from the road behind wrought iron fences and dense hedges. Her GPS chimed. "Your destination is on the right." Clara pulled over to the shoulder. She stared at the imposing iron gates of 4200 North Shore Drive. They were flanked by stone pillars. A security camera glowed with a faint red eye in the darkness. She left the engine idling. Her hands were shaking. This was the moment to turn around. She had proven her point, whatever that was. She was out of her mind. She reached for the gear shift to put it in reverse. Before her hand touched the plastic knob, a heavy mechanical groan cut through the sound of the rain. Clara watched, her breath catching in her throat as the massive iron gates slowly swung open. They were waiting for her. A cold spike of adrenaline hit her system. It was the most alive she had felt in 2 years. She took her foot off the brake and eased the Civic forward, the tires crunching over the immaculate gravel driveway. The driveway wound through a dark, manicured landscape before opening up into a circular courtyard. In the center stood a stone fountain, dry and silent. Beyond it was the house. It was a sprawling, modern masterpiece of concrete, glass, and dark wood. It looked like a museum. She parked her battered Honda next to a sleek, matte black Audi that cost more than her entire life. She turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. Clara stepped out into the rain. She didn't run to the door. She walked slowly, letting the cold water hit her face. There was no awning, no porch, just a massive, heavy oak door. It clicked open before she could knock. A man in a dark suit stood in the threshold. He wasn't the man she was here to see. She knew that instantly. He was too broad, his eyes too flat. He looked like a professional obstacle. "He's in the study," the man said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of emotion. He stepped aside. Clara stepped into the house. The air was warm, smelling of cedar, expensive leather, and something faint and metallic underneath. Blood? She shoved the thought down. "Down the hall," the guard said, closing the door behind her with a heavy, final thud. "Last door on the left." Clara walked down the hallway. The floorboards were wide plank mahogany, silencing her footsteps. The walls were painted a dark, charcoal grey, bare except for small, recessed lights that cast long shadows. She reached the last door on the left. It was ajar. She pushed it open. The study was cavernous. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the cliffside, the black ocean churning far below. The only light came from a dying fire in a massive stone hearth and a single brass lamp on a sprawling desk. A man stood by the windows. He had his back to her. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a tailored grey suit jacket. He held a crystal glass, the ice clinking softly as he swirled the amber liquid. "You actually came," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth but carrying a rough, sandpaper edge. He didn't turn around. Clara stood in the doorway, water dripping from her jacket onto the expensive rug. "You left the gates open." "I did." He took a sip of his drink. "I didn't expect a rusted Honda Civic to drive through them. The security cameras were quite insulted. It gets good gas mileage." He chuckled. It was a dry, humorless sound. Finally he turned. Clara felt a physical jolt in her chest. He was older than her, maybe mid-30s. His face was a study in hard angles and tired lines. He had dark, messy hair and a shadow of stubble along his jawline. His eyes were dark, calculating, and completely exhausted. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night in a decade. He wasn't conventionally handsome. He was striking, dangerous. He studied her in return. He took in her wet hair, her cheap boots, the faded leather jacket. His gaze was heavy, dissecting her in a matter of seconds. "You look like you're going to a funeral," he observed, walking slowly toward a leather armchair near the fire. "I just buried a 2-year relationship," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. She refused to cross her arms. She refused to look small. "So, yes." Arthur stopped and looked at her, truly looked at her. Most people who walked into this room were trembling, sweating, begging for their lives or their money. This woman was just standing there, dripping on his Persian rug, looking at him with a mix of defiance and utter exhaustion. "And who is the idiot?" Arthur asked, sitting down in the armchair. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward. "Todd," Arthur frowned. "Todd. That sounds like a man who wears polo shirts with the collar popped." "He works in software sales," Clara said flatly, "and he forgot my birthday, and our anniversary, and he's currently at a bar with a blonde woman named Brittany. Tragic." Arthur gestured to the matching armchair opposite him. "Sit down, Clara." She froze. "I didn't tell you my name. You drove a car registered to a Clara Hayes into my private estate," Arthur said, his tone entirely casual. "My men ran your plates before you hit the second speed bump in the driveway. You have 3 unpaid parking tickets and a student loan you're deferring." Clara swallowed hard. The reality of where she was, of who she was dealing with, finally crashed over her. "Who are you?" "My name is Arthur." He didn't offer a last name. He didn't need to. Clara knew enough about the city to know the rumors, the syndicates that operated out of the ports, the men who owned the judges, the shadows that moved behind the gleaming skyscrapers. "You run things," she whispered. "I manage logistics," he corrected smoothly. He picked up a crystal decanter from a side table and poured a generous measure of scotch into a second glass. He held it out to her. "Drink?" Clara walked forward slowly. She felt like a mouse stepping into a very clean, very expensive trap. She took the glass. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was warm, his knuckles scarred. She sat down in the armchair. The leather was soft, pulling her in. "Why did you text me back?" Clara asked, taking a sip. The liquor burned a fiery path down her throat, settling heavily in her stomach. Arthur leaned back, studying the amber liquid in his own glass. "It was a slow night. I was dealing with a liar. Your text. It was refreshingly honest, brutal. I appreciated the lack of subtext. I was angry." "You were wounded," Arthur corrected quietly. "There's a difference. Anger is loud. Wounded is what you are right now, sitting in a stranger's house, drinking scotch you hate, because it's better than sitting in an empty apartment." Clara bristled. "I don't hate scotch." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "You just suppressed a gag reflex." She glared at him. "Fine, I prefer wine." "I'll have them bring up a bottle." He didn't move to press a buzzer or make a call. He just stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "You said you'd make me forget him," Clara finally said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It sounded like a challenge. Arthur's eyes darkened. The cynical amusement vanished, replaced by something predatory, yet strangely restrained. He didn't smile. He set his glass down on the table with a soft clink. "I did say that." He leaned forward again, bridging the space between them. He smelled of rain, smoke, and danger. "But I think you came here hoping I'd kill him." Clara's breath caught. No. Arthur tilted his head. "Not even a little bit? When you realized you were texting someone who lives behind iron gates and has armed guards at the door, you didn't think, just for a second, how easy it would be." "I don't want anyone dead," Clara said, her voice shaking for the first time. I just want him to not matter anymore. Arthur watched her for a long time. He saw the frayed edges of her sleeves, the dark circles under her eyes, the sheer willpower holding her together. In his world, people broke loudly. They shattered. Clara was breaking quietly, folding in on herself. He doesn't matter, Arthur said softly. He's a ghost, Clara. You just haven't stopped holding the seance. He stood up, towering over her. Clara tipped her head back to look at him, her pulse hammering against her ribs. He reached down, but not to grab her. He took the half-empty glass of scotch from her white-knuckled grip and set it aside. "Come with me," he ordered softly. "Where?" "To make you forget." Clara didn't move. "Are you going to hurt me?" Arthur paused. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had ordered the destruction of men's lives just an hour prior. Then he looked back at her face. "No," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a trace of genuine humanity, a quiet, weary sincerity. "I deal enough damage in my day job. I don't need to bring it into my living room." He offered his hand. Clara looked at it. It was an invitation into the dark. It was a terrible idea. It was the end of her safe, boring, miserable life. She reached up and took it. Arthur's hand was rough. Calluses lined his palms, telling a story of manual labor that didn't quite match the bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't pull Clara. He simply guided her, his grip firm but entirely lacking in coercion. They walked back down the silent, mahogany-lined hallway. The air in the house was perfectly climate-controlled, yet Clara felt a strange, electric heat radiating from the space between them. He didn't lead her to a bedroom. He bypassed a sweeping, glass-railed staircase and pushed through a set of heavy swinging doors. They entered a kitchen. It wasn't the sort of kitchen where people actually lived. It looked like the prep line of a Michelin-starred restaurant after closing. Acres of stainless steel, a 6-burner industrial gas range, and 2 massive refrigerators humming a low mechanical tune. The lights overhead were stark and bright, a sharp contrast to the moody shadows of the study. Arthur let go of her hand. The sudden loss of contact left a cold patch on Clara's skin. He walked over to the island, shedding his suit jacket and draping it over a steel stool. He unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a faded, jagged scar that slashed across his left wrist. "Sit," he instructed, nodding to a stool. Clara sat. She pulled her wet leather jacket tight around her chest. "Are you going to interrogate me under these lights?" Arthur opened a massive refrigerator. "I already know everything I need to know about you, Clara. I'm going to feed you." "I told you, I dumped my dinner in the trash." "I know." He pulled out a carton of eggs, a block of Parmigiano Reggiano, and a slab of cured meat that looked alarmingly expensive. "Which means you're operating on an empty stomach, a bad breakup, and half a glass of mediocre scotch. That is a volatile combination." He moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. There was no hesitation. He grabbed a heavy steel pan, threw it on the burner, and twisted the knob. Blue flame hissed to life. "I don't need you to cook for me," Clara said, though her stomach betrayed her with a loud, hollow rumble. Arthur didn't look up. He took a heavy chef's knife from a magnetic block and began slicing the meat. The blade hit the cutting board in a rapid, rhythmic staccato. Thwack, thwack, thwack. "You came here because you wanted to forget a man who treats you like an afterthought," Arthur said. The fat in the pan began to sizzle, filling the sterile air with the heavy, rich scent of rendering pork. The easiest way to overwrite a bad memory is to replace it with a visceral, grounding sensory experience. He cracked 3 eggs into a glass bowl with one hand. He beat them with a fork, the sharp clinking sound cutting through the hiss of the stove. "Is this how you run your business?" Clara asked. "By psychoanalyzing people over a hot stove? In my business, people usually lose their appetites when I start talking." He grated a mountain of cheese into the eggs. "You, however, are a civilian, and you look like you haven't had a hot meal that didn't come out of a microwave in 6 months." It was an insulting, entirely accurate observation. Clara crossed her arms, resting them on the cool steel of the counter. She watched him. The sheer absurdity of the situation washed over her. 2 hours ago, she was crying over a cracked phone screen in a damp apartment. Now a man who likely ordered hits before breakfast was making her carbonara at midnight. He tossed a handful of fresh pasta into a pot of boiling water. For 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was functional. Clara watched the tension bleed out of Arthur's shoulders as he worked. It was the only time he looked human. He plated the food with no fanfare, sliding a steaming, golden bowl of pasta across the steel island. He handed her a heavy silver fork. "Eat." Clara took a bite. The richness of the egg, the sharp bite of the cheese, the salty crunch of the pork, it coated her tongue, thick and grounding. It was, without a doubt, the best thing she had ever tasted. She didn't realize how hungry she was until she started. She ate quickly, abandoning all pretense of manners. Arthur leaned against the counter opposite her, a glass of water in his hand. He watched her eat. He wasn't smiling, but the exhaustion in his eyes had retreated, replaced by a quiet, intense focus. "Better?" he asked, when her bowl was half empty. Clara swallowed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She felt a flush of embarrassment. "It's good. It's perfect," Arthur corrected dryly. "Don't undersell my culinary skills." Before Clara could reply, her phone vibrated against the stainless steel counter. It sounded like a chainsaw in the quiet kitchen. They both looked at it. The cracked screen lit up. Incoming call. Todd. The warmth of the food vanished in Clara's stomach, replaced by a familiar block of ice. Her shoulders tensed, her eyes locked on the screen. The dive bar must have closed. He had gone home, found her gone, and read the text. The phone vibrated violently, inching across the metal surface. Clara reached out, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't know whether to answer and yell, or silence it and hide. Old habits pulled at her, demanding she explain herself, demanding she manage his emotions. Arthur's hand shot out, moving faster than Clara could process. His heavy palm clamped down over the phone, stopping its movement. He looked at her. His eyes were completely unreadable. "Do you want to talk to him?" Arthur asked. His voice was low, dangerous. Clara stared at Arthur's hand, then up to his face. "No," she whispered. Arthur picked up the phone. He didn't hand it to her. He swiped the green button. Arthur pressed the phone to his ear. He didn't say a word. Through the cracked speaker, Clara could hear the tinny, aggressive voice on the other end. "Clara, where the hell are you? I come home. The place is a mess. And you send me some psychotic text message? It was a work thing, okay? Brittany is a client. You need to stop being so damn dramatic and get back here, right now." Todd's voice was slurred. It was the voice of a man who was used to being accommodated, a man who thought an angry text was just another tantrum he could put down with a minimum of effort. Arthur listened. His expression didn't shift. He looked like a man evaluating a particularly unimpressive spreadsheet. "Clara, are you there? Stop playing games, damn it. Answer me." Arthur finally spoke. "She's not playing games, Todd, and she is certainly not answering you." Silence hung on the other end of the line for a long, heavy second. When Todd spoke again, the aggression was laced with sudden, sharp confusion. "Who the hell is this? Where is Clara? She's currently sitting in my kitchen, eating carbonara, and realizing how monumentally low she set the bar for the last 2 years," Arthur said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Put her on the phone," Todd demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Right now, who are you?" "I am the mistake you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting," Arthur said smoothly. There was no theatrical threat in his voice. He wasn't yelling. That was what made it terrifying. It was absolute, factual certainty. "Clara's things will be collected tomorrow by a moving company. Do not be in the apartment when they arrive. Do not attempt to contact this number again. If you text her, if you call her, if you so much as look up her LinkedIn profile, I will know. Are you threatening me? I'll call the cops." Todd blustered, but the fear was palpable. "Call them," Arthur invited softly. "Ask for Detective Russo in the 9th Precinct. Tell him Arthur said hello. Then ask him what happens to people who bore me." He pulled the phone away from his ear and tapped the red button, cutting Todd off mid-stammer. Arthur placed the phone gently on the counter and slid it back toward Clara. "He won't call again." Clara stared at the dark screen. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She felt a bizarre mixture of profound relief and sheer terror. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice unsteady. "Yes, I did," Arthur replied, walking over to the sink to wash the pan. "Because if I handed it to you, you would have apologized for upsetting him. You are conditioned to absorb his collateral damage. You don't know me. I know the mechanics of human leverage, Clara. It's what I do for a living." Before Clara could form a rebuttal, the swinging doors to the kitchen pushed open. The man who entered was different from the guard at the front door. He was older, wearing a tailored navy suit. His silver hair was slicked back, and his eyes were sharp. He held a tablet in his hand. "Arthur," the man said. He didn't look at Clara. He treated her like a piece of furniture. Arthur didn't turn off the water. "What is it, Bennett?" "The docks," Bennett said quietly. "Leo was lying. The shipment wasn't intercepted by the Port Authority. It was diverted. The Chechen crew signed off on the manifest 3 hours ago." The temperature in the room plummeted. The domestic illusion of the kitchen, the smell of garlic, the warm pasta, the quiet conversation, shattered instantly. Arthur turned off the tap. He dried his hands slowly on a towel. When he turned around, the man who had cooked for Clara was gone. His posture was rigid, his eyes cold and dead. "They diverted it to where?" Arthur asked. "A warehouse in the industrial district, Sector 4. "Get the cars ready," Arthur ordered. "Assemble the extraction team. I want 4 men on the perimeter, 2 on the roof. No one leaves that warehouse breathing until I have the manifest in my hand." "Yes, sir." Bennett turned on his heel and walked out. Clara sat frozen on the steel stool. The words hung in the air. "No one leaves that warehouse breathing." Arthur threw the towel onto the counter. He walked over to his jacket, pulling it on, adjusting the cuffs with practiced precision. He looked at Clara. He saw the horror creeping into her eyes. "My day job," he said quietly, the gravelly edge returning to his voice. "You're leaving," she said. "It wasn't a question. I have a mess to clean up." Arthur walked toward the door, stopping just a few feet from her. He looked down at her, a fleeting shadow of regret crossing his face. "There are 5 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. Take your pick. The doors lock from the inside. My men will not come upstairs." "You expect me to sleep here?" "I expect you not to go back to an empty apartment and a broken life at 1 in the morning," Arthur countered, You are safe here, Clara. Safer than you are anywhere else in this city. Because you're the one everyone is afraid of, she whispered. Exactly. Arthur turned toward the door. Good night, Clara. The doors swung shut behind him. A minute later, Clara heard the distant, guttural roar of multiple high-powered engines roaring to life, fading quickly into the rainy night. She was alone in a fortress. She looked down at her empty bowl of pasta. Then she looked at her cracked phone. She picked it up and walked out of the kitchen, heading for the stairs. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't check to see if Todd had messaged her back. The bed was too soft. The sheets felt like spun silk. Clara had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flat, dead look in Arthur's eyes when Bennett mentioned the docks. She heard the casual way he ordered violence. The rain had stopped by dawn. Pale, greyish light filtered through the heavy blackout curtains of the guest bedroom. It was a massive room, decorated in minimalist whites and greys. It felt like a high-end hotel room, impersonal and cold. Clara sat up. She was still wearing her faded black jeans and the oversized sweater. Her leather jacket lay in a heap on an armchair. It was 7 a.m. Reality was a brutal hangover. The adrenaline of the night before had evaporated, leaving behind a stark, terrifying clarity. She had fled a toxic relationship, only to spend the night in the heavily guarded compound of a crime lord. She needed to leave. She needed to get in her Civic, drive back to the city, pack her things and disappear before she became permanently entangled in a world that dealt in blood and shipping manifests. She slipped her boots on and grabbed her jacket. She unlocked the heavy bedroom door. It clicked loudly in the silence. She crept down the sweeping glass staircase. The house was dead quiet. The shadows of the night had been chased away by the morning light pouring through the massive windows. She reached the bottom of the stairs and headed for the front door. Leaving without saying goodbye? Clara stopped dead. The voice came from the study. She turned slowly and walked toward the open door. Arthur was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk. He hadn't changed clothes. His suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair, his tie was gone, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His sleeves were rolled up. There was a fresh, bruised cut high on his left cheekbone. A faint smudge of dried blood stained his knuckles. He was drinking black coffee from a ceramic mug, staring at a laptop screen. He looked exhausted. He looked dangerous. He looked exactly like a man who had spent the night enforcing his will on the world. Clara stood in the doorway, gripping her leather jacket tight. "I didn't think you'd be back. I am remarkably efficient," Arthur said, not taking his eyes off the screen. He typed something, hit enter, and finally looked up at her. "Did you sleep?" "No." "Neither did I." He leaned back in his leather chair, studying her. In the daylight, he looked older. The lines around his eyes were deeper. "You're running." "I'm going home," Clara corrected, lifting her chin. "To Todd. To pack my things, to find a new apartment, to get on with my boring, mundane life." Arthur took a sip of his coffee. He set the mug down slowly. "It's raining out there, Clara. Figuratively speaking, your boring life is safe, but it's cold. You're going to go back, you're going to pack, and you're going to feel hollow. And staying here is better?" She shot back, her voice tight. She pointed a trembling finger at his face. "You have blood on your hands, literally. I heard you last night. You kill people." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't offer excuses. He just sat there, absorbing her accusation with the stillness of a stone wall. "I control chaos," Arthur said evenly. "I ensure that the violence in this city remains localized, predictable, and profitable. If I wasn't here, men much worse than me would burn it to the ground. That is my reality. I will never apologize for it. He stood up. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. He was too large, too imposing in the morning light. "I am exactly what you think I am," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I am not a good man. I don't pretend to be. But when you texted me last night, you weren't looking for a good man. You were looking for a way out." Clara swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "You said you'd make me forget him." "And did you think about him last night?" Arthur asked. Clara paused. She searched her mind. From the moment the iron gate swung open, Todd had ceased to exist. He had been eclipsed entirely by the sheer gravitational pull of the man standing in front of her. "No," she admitted softly. Arthur stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. "You want to leave? The door is open. The guards will let you out. You can get in your Civic and drive back to the middle class. You can forget this ever happened." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver key. He placed it on the edge of the mahogany desk. "But if you're tired of being ordinary," Arthur continued, his eyes locked onto hers, burning with a dark, intense heat. "If you're tired of being ignored, accommodated, and overlooked, you stay. You take the key. It opens the private elevator to the penthouse downtown. You go there. You wait for me." Clara looked at the key. It gleamed under the brass desk lamp. It was a physical manifestation of a crossroads. One path led back to a life of quiet desperation. The other led into the epicenter of a hurricane. "Why me?" Clara asked, looking up at him. "You could have anyone. Why do you want a data entry clerk with a broken phone?" Arthur reached out. His scarred hand brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he was capable of. "Because everyone in my world lies to me," Arthur whispered. "They tell me what I want to hear. They cower. They scheme. You walked into my house, insulted my security, complained about my scotch, and looked at me like a human being." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "I don't want someone who belongs in my world, Clara. I want someone who survives it. Now, make a choice." He dropped his hand, turned around, and walked back to his laptop. He didn't look at her again. Clara stood by the door for a long time. The house was silent. The engine of her Honda Civic was waiting outside. Her old life was waiting. She slowly let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She walked toward the desk. The sound of her boots against the mahogany floorboards echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. She reached out. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy silver key. The drive back into the city was a blur of grey asphalt and flashing brake lights. Clara navigated her dented Honda Civic through the morning gridlock, the heavy silver key resting in the cup holder like a live grenade. She drove past her old exit. She drove past the street that led to the apartment she shared with Todd. The physical act of keeping her foot on the gas, of not turning the steering wheel toward the familiar, took every ounce of willpower she possessed. Her chest ached with a strange phantom pain, the death throes of a life she was actively abandoning. Downtown loomed ahead, a jagged skyline of glass and steel piercing the overcast sky. The address attached to the key led her to a high-rise residential tower that looked less like an apartment building and more like a monolith of extreme wealth. There was no gravel driveway here, just a discreet underground parking entrance, guarded by a man in a tailored suit who checked her license plate, glanced at her beaten-up car with a flicker of masked surprise, and silently raised the barrier. She parked between a silver Porsche and a pristine vintage Mustang. The private elevator was a polished steel box requiring the physical key. Clara inserted it, turned it, and braced herself. There were no buttons. The doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss, and the elevator surged upward, pulling the floor away from her stomach. It opened directly into the penthouse. Clara stepped out, cautiously. The heavy leather jacket clutched tight against her chest. If the cliffside estate was a fortress, this was a watchtower. It was a sprawling, open-concept space of white marble, brushed steel, and glass walls that offered a staggering 360-degree view of the city. The clouds hung low outside, casting a muted, cinematic light over the minimalist furniture. It was utterly, profoundly silent. Clara walked to the edge of the living room, pressing her hand flat against the cold glass. Far below, the city moved like a frantic, meaningless ant farm. Cars crawled along the arteries of the streets. Sirens flashed silently in the distance. Down there was Todd. Down there was her data entry job, the pile of bills, the cracked phone. Up here, she was entirely unmoored. She spent the first 2 hours pacing. She explored the space not with curiosity, but with the cautious edge of a trespasser. There was a kitchen that looked like it had never seen a warm meal, a master bathroom wrapped in black slate, and a king-sized bed perfectly made with slate-grey linen. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no books on the glass coffee table. It was the living space of a ghost. By noon, the adrenaline crash hit her with physical force. Clara curled up on the massive, stark white modular sofa, pulling her knees to her chest. She fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep, exhausted by the sheer emotional whiplash of the last 14 hours. She woke to the sound of ice clinking against crystal. The penthouse was dark. The city outside had transformed into a grid of glittering gold and harsh neon. Clara bolted upright, her heart hammering. Arthur stood by a floating wet bar in the center of the room. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he was pouring whiskey from a square decanter. The warm amber light from a single floor lamp cast long, sharp shadows across his face. He looked over his shoulder at her. The bruising on his cheekbone had darkened to a deep, ugly purple. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been in the morning, scraped raw by whatever he had been doing all day. Clara swung her legs off the sofa, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The sudden reality of his presence filled the cavernous room, making it feel dangerously small. "What time is it?" "Past 8. He walked over, carrying 2 glasses. He offered her one. She didn't suppress a grimace this time. "I told you I prefer wine. There is a bottle of Chateau Margaux breathing on the counter. But I strongly suggest the whiskey," Arthur replied dryly. "You look like you need the burn." Clara took the glass. She didn't drink. She watched him sink into the armchair opposite the sofa. He didn't sit like a man relaxing. He sat like a soldier collapsing after a march, every muscle slowly disengaging with a quiet, invisible ache. "Did you get your manifest back?" Clara asked, her voice quiet in the vast room. Arthur looked at his glass, swirling the liquid slowly. "I did." "And the men who took it?" "They will no longer be participating in the local economy." He said it with zero inflection. It wasn't a boast. It was an administrative update. Clara felt a chill race down her spine, a stark reminder of exactly who she was sharing a drink with. "Are you afraid of me right now, Clara?" Arthur asked, looking up. His dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the space between them. "I'm terrified," Clara answered honestly. She took a sip of the whiskey. It burned exactly as promised, sending a flare of heat into her chest. "But I'm more terrified of going back down there." She pointed to the window. Arthur watched her. The silence stretched, thick and charged. "Why is there nothing of yours in here?" she asked, gesturing to the sterile room. "You live here, but there's no trace of you. It looks like a waiting room." "I don't live here," Arthur said. He rested his elbows on his knees, leaning forward. "I survive here. I sleep. I shower. I make phone calls. The estate on the cliffs is a fortress for my business. This is a vault for me. It's lonely. It's secure." Clara set her glass down on the glass coffee table with a sharp clack. "It's a cage, a really expensive glass cage." Arthur let out a low, breathy chuckle. It was a genuine sound, lacking his usual cynical edge. "You have a remarkable talent for walking into my property and insulting my interior design. Someone has to." Clara stood up. The whiskey was making her bold. Or maybe it was just the profound, reckless freedom of having already burned her old life to the ground. She walked over to him, stopping inches from his knees. Arthur tilted his head back, looking up at her. The exhaustion in his face was stark under the dim light. The cut on his cheekbone looked angry. "You're bleeding again," she noted, her voice dropping. Arthur reached up, his fingers brushing the cut. He looked at the fresh smear of red on his fingertips with mild annoyance. A minor disagreement during negotiations. "Sit still." Clara turned and walked toward the slate-wrapped bathroom. She rummaged through the impeccably organized, terrifyingly sharp cabinets until she found a basic first aid kit. She grabbed a damp washcloth and walked back out. Arthur hadn't moved. He watched her approach with a predatory stillness, his eyes tracking her every movement. Clara stood between his parted knees. The heat rolling off his body was intense. She didn't hesitate. She pressed the damp cloth to his cheekbone. Arthur hissed slightly, his jaw clenching, but he didn't pull away. "For a man who manages logistics, you seem to take a lot of physical damage," Clara murmured, focusing entirely on the task to avoid looking directly into his dark, heavy gaze. "The logistics sometimes require a hands-on approach." Arthur's voice was a low rumble in his chest, vibrating through the small space between them. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the arms of the chair, moved. He didn't grab her. He placed his large, scarred palms lightly on her hips. Clara froze. The washcloth stalled against his skin. Her breath hitched. The touch was a branding, anchoring her to the floor. "Why did you stay, Clara?" he asked softly. "I told you. I didn't want to go back." "That's why you left him," Arthur corrected. "I'm asking why you stayed for me." Clara finally looked down. His eyes were searching hers, completely unguarded. There was no Mafia boss in the chair right now. There was just a man who was deeply, fundamentally exhausted, looking at her like she was the first real thing he had touched in years. "Because you didn't let me answer the phone," Clara whispered. "Because you saw exactly how pathetic I was being. And instead of taking advantage of it, you made me carbonara." Arthur's hands tightened slightly on her hips. "I am a selfish man, Clara. Do not mistake me for a savior. I didn't stop you from answering the phone for your sake. I stopped you because the moment you walked into my study, dripping wet and completely unafraid to challenge me, I decided I wasn't going to let you leave." The confession hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. It was possessive. It was a red flag the size of a billboard. And Clara didn't care. For 2 years, she had begged to be seen. She had twisted herself into knots to be convenient, to be agreeable, to be an afterthought. Now, she was standing in front of a man who commanded an underworld, and he was looking at her like she was the center of gravity. She dropped the washcloth onto the table. She cupped his jaw with both hands, her thumbs tracing the rough stubble. Arthur let out a ragged exhale. His hand slid from her hips to the small of her back, pulling her flush against him. He didn't kiss her gently. There was no hesitation. When his mouth crashed against hers, it was desperate. It tasted of whiskey, copper, and absolute certainty. Clara gasped against his lips, her fingers tangling in his dark, messy hair. The kiss was a collision. It was all the pent-up tension of the last 24 hours, shattering at once. Arthur stood up, breaking the kiss just long enough to lift her entirely off the ground. Clara wrapped her legs around his waist, clinging to his broad shoulders as he walked them backward until her back hit the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. The city sprawled out beneath them, millions of lights completely oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere. "You're sure?" Arthur growled against her neck, his breath hot against her skin. It was a final warning, a final out. "Make me forget," Clara breathed, pulling his face back down to hers. He did. The rain returned in the early hours of the morning, tapping a steady, rhythmic beat against the thick glass of the penthouse. Clara lay tangled in the slate-grey sheets. The bed was enormous, but she was pressed entirely against Arthur's side. He was asleep, one heavy arm draped protectively over her waist, his face buried in the crook of her neck. In sleep, the hard angles of his face were softened. The calculating, ruthless edge was gone. He just looked like a man. Clara stared at the ceiling. Her body ached in a pleasant, grounding way. Her mind, usually a chaotic hum of anxieties, checklists and self-doubt, was eerily quiet. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. She gently slid out from under his arm. Arthur grumbled softly, shifting his weight, but didn't wake. Clara pulled on one of his discarded white dress shirts. It swallowed her frame, falling to her mid-thigh, smelling intensely of cedar and him. She walked out to the living room. The city was shrouded in morning fog. She found her cracked phone on the kitchen counter, right where she had dumped it yesterday. The screen was dark. She tapped it. 47 missed calls, 112 unread messages, all from Todd. Clara scrolled through the notifications. The frantic progression was predictably pathetic. 11:14 p.m. "Clara, where are you? Stop this. 1:14 a.m. I'm calling the police. Who was that guy? 3:14 a.m. Please come home. I'm sorry. I messed up. 6:00 Clara, please. I love you." 2 days ago, that last text would have broken her. It would have sent her running back, ready to absorb his guilt and mend the relationship. She would have convinced herself that the apology was real, that this time it would be different. Now? She felt absolutely nothing. Reading his texts felt like reading a manual for a piece of machinery she no longer owned. Arthur had been right. Todd was a ghost, and the séance was officially over. Reading the obituary? Clara jumped, spinning around. Arthur stood in the doorway of the bedroom. He was wearing nothing but a pair of dark sweatpants hanging low on his hips. His torso was a map of scars, some old and faded white, others jagged and recent. It was a stark, brutal visual of the violence he orchestrated. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a quiet intensity. "Just closing the book," Clara said. She didn't delete the messages. She didn't block the number. She simply held the volume and power buttons, initiated a factory reset, and watched the screen go black as the Apple logo appeared, wiping away 2 years of her life in 10 seconds. She tossed the phone into the stainless steel trash can. It hit the bottom with a hollow, satisfying thud. Arthur's mouth twitched. It was the closest thing she had seen to a real smile from him. He walked across the cold marble floor, closing the distance between them. "I bought you a new one," he said. He reached over the counter, opening a drawer, and pulled out a pristine, matte black box. He slid it across the marble to her. Clara looked at the box. It wasn't just a phone. It was a leash. It was a tether to his world. "Does this one come with a tracker?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. 2, actually, Arthur replied smoothly, leaning his elbows on the counter. 1 for the hardware, 1 for the SIM, my head of security insisted. Clara crossed her arms, the oversized sleeves of his shirt hanging loosely. And if I don't want to be tracked? Arthur reached out, catching the collar of the shirt and gently pulling her toward him across the counter. Then you throw it in the trash with the old one, and you walk out the door. But if you take it, Clara, you are in. You are under my protection. You are part of my logistics, and I do not lose things that belong to me. His gaze was heavy, pinning her in place. There was no romance in the statement. It was a factual declaration of ownership and defense. I'm not a shipping container, Arthur, Clara said, refusing to look away. I'm not something you manage. No, Arthur agreed, his thumb brushing over her collarbone. You are the only thing in my life I can't control, which is exactly why I need to know where you are. He leaned in, kissing her softly. It was a stark contrast to the rough desperation of the night before. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely anchoring. Take the phone, Clara. Clara looked at the sleek black box. She thought of her empty apartment. She thought of the cold pasta. She thought of the hollow, aching loneliness of being entirely safe and completely ignored. She picked up the box. If your security team tracks me to a thrift store, they have to carry my bags, Clara said deadpan. Arthur let out a loud, genuine laugh. It was a rich, deep sound that completely transformed his face, making him look 5 years younger. Deal. 3 weeks later, the rain had finally given way to a crisp, biting autumn wind. Clara stood by the massive windows of the penthouse, sipping coffee from a ceramic mug. She was wearing a tailored black turtleneck and high-waisted trousers. Her hair was pulled back sharply. The faded leather jacket was gone, replaced by a cashmere coat currently draped over the armchair. She looked entirely different. She felt entirely different. The transition hadn't been seamless. Arthur's world was a jagged, high-stakes ecosystem. There were nights he didn't come home, nights the encrypted burner phone he gave her rang with terse instructions to stay inside and not open the door for anyone but Bennett. She learned the rules quickly. She learned not to ask about the stains on his cuffs. She learned how to read the subtle shifts in his posture that meant a negotiation had gone south. But amidst the chaos, she found an anchor. Arthur didn't treat her like a fragile piece of porcelain. He didn't hide his darkness from her. He brought her into his study, let her read the financials he legally laundered, and listened to her sharp, pragmatic insights. He valued her mind as much as he craved her presence. For the first time in her life, Clara wasn't standing behind a man. She was standing beside him. The private elevator pinged. The steel doors slid open. Arthur stepped out. He was wearing a dark, bespoke, three-piece suit. He looked immaculate, sharp, and intensely dangerous. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand. He stopped when he saw her by the window. The cold, calculating mask he wore for the world instantly fractured. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "You're back early," Clara noted, setting her mug down on the glass table. "The Port Authority was surprisingly cooperative today," Arthur said, dropping his briefcase by the door. He walked toward her, loosening his tie as he moved. Or perhaps they just saw the news about the sudden retirement of the union boss. I read about that. "Tragic golfing accident," Clara said dryly. Arthur stopped in front of her. He reached out, his warm hands resting on her waist. Tragic. He leaned down and kissed her. It was a grounding ritual they had developed. The moment he crossed the threshold, the violence of his day was left at the door. Here, in the glass cage, they were just Arthur and Clara. "I have to go to the Cliffside estate tonight," Arthur murmured against her temple. "A meeting with the northern families. It will be tedious and likely hostile." He pulled back, looking down at her. "I want you to come with me." Clara paused. She had never been to a formal meeting. She had stayed on the periphery, the ghost in the penthouse. Bringing her to a sit-down with rival syndicates wasn't just an invitation. It was a declaration. "You want to introduce me to the wolves?" she asked, tilting her head. "I want the wolves to know exactly who they are dealing with," Arthur corrected, his eyes darkening. "I want them to see the one thing in this world they are forbidden to touch, and I want them to see that she doesn't flinch." Clara looked at the man who had answered a wrong number and violently dismantled her mundane existence. He was a monster to the city, a tyrant to his rivals. But to her, he was the only man who had ever truly paid attention. She didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, cynical thrill rising in her chest. "Let me grab my coat," Clara said, a sharp, confident smile playing on her lips. "I wouldn't want to keep the wolves waiting." Arthur smiled back, a dangerous, predatory curve of his mouth. He offered his arm. Clara took it. She had sent a breakup text into the void, hoping to sever a frayed thread of a broken life. Instead, she had accidentally woven herself into a tapestry of absolute power. She walked toward the elevator with the king of the underworld, entirely unbothered by the darkness. She had finally found a man who knew exactly how to make her forget. If you loved this story of accidental fate and dangerous romance, don't forget to hit that like button. Clara's journey from a heartbroken text to ruling the underworld beside Arthur proves that sometimes the wrong number is exactly the right destination. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly deep dive audio dramas and dark romance stories.